After more than a dozen senior Chinese military officials were removed from office in just the last week of December, and a slew of further-reaching corruption charges, dismissals, and even a mysterious death or two masked throughout the rest of 2023, it's become evident that something is seriously wrong in the highest echelons of China's defense apparatus. And according to an explosive new report from Bloomberg, the problem may be so extensive that they're forcing Chinese President Xi Jinping to rethink his plans for invading Taiwan. Let's talk about these reports of Chinese missiles being filled with water, missile silos with doors that don't open, and what now appears to be the largest crackdown on Chinese military leadership in modern history. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. On January 6, 2024, Bloomberg journalists Peter Martin and Jennifer Jacobs released the sort of exclusive story that, to be honest, I usually read with a heavy dose of skepticism. In their article, Martin and Jacobs cite unnamed sources within the American intelligence community who are familiar with recent internal assessments of China's ongoing military purge. These anonymous sources highlighted widespread corruption throughout nearly all of China's military and industrial base, but particularly within the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, often known as the PLARF. The PLARF is the branch of China's military responsible for the nation's rapidly expanding nuclear missile arsenal, as well as the cruise and ballistic anti-ship missiles that serve as the backbone of China's anti-access area denial strategy in the Pacific, including systems like China's sole in-service hypersonic weapon, the DF-ZF Boost Glide Vehicle. In both Defense Department and think tank-run wargame scenarios meant to simulate a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, the PLARF has been instrumental in striking air bases and naval vessels in the region in order to allow Chinese ships to ferry troops across the 100-mile Taiwan Strait. In other words, the PLARF is the backbone of China's contemporary military strategies. I'm going to go ahead and just quote that Bloomberg report. The U.S. assessments cited several examples of the impact of graft, including missiles filled with water instead of fuel, and vast fields of missile silos in western China with lids that don't function in a way that would allow the missiles to launch effectively. It goes on to say, the corruption inside China's rocket force and throughout the nation's defense industrial base is so extensive that U.S. officials now believe Xi is less likely to contemplate major military action in the coming years that would have otherwise been the case, according to the people who asked not to be named discussing this intelligence. Now, I should be clear that my skepticism has nothing to do with the journalists in particular or with the outlet, but rather with their unnamed sources. Whenever I see news coverage pivot on anonymous sources within the defense or intelligence apparatus, I can't help but think back to my days as a lowly sergeant with a security clearance, delivering coffee to senior officers in secure conference rooms. Did these journalists speak to the lieutenant colonel who pored over the raw intelligence to form cohesive conclusions based on the evidence available? Or did they speak to the guy delivering coffee who overheard enough to form his own strong opinions? In the minds of most journalists, either source would be considered an insider. But for those of us who've been in some of these rooms, we understand that there is a significant difference between being in the room and actually being well-versed in the material that's being briefed. That is to say that anonymous sources can be a bit of a mixed bag. Sometimes they may be subject matter experts who know far more than they can relay and are leaking information to the media with intent, but other times they're tertiary actors who understand the broad strokes of a topic, but not all of the context or details, and just like a little bit of attention. But, and there is always a but, the verifiable information that goes along with these claims are actually just as, if not more shocking than the anonymous claims themselves. Because throughout 2023, turmoil within the Chinese military has been too conspicuous to hide, even for a regime that controls all media within its borders. So let's start with talking about what we know for sure. But before I start, I'd like to apologize for what I'm sure will be a very muddled effort at pronouncing many of these names. In March of 2023, PLA Rocket Force Commander Wei Feng resigned from his post as expected following a regular duration of his tour, but interestingly, went missing immediately after and has not been seen since. 3 months later, in June, new Rocket Force Commander Li Yuchao, Rocket Force Commissar Zhu Zongbo, and his 2 deputies, Lu Gongbin and Zhang Xinzong, were all unceremoniously removed from office with no official explanation and rampant rumors about corruption and espionage charges. The month after that, in July, former Rocket Force Deputy Commander Wu Guohua died under mysterious circumstances, with one news outlet reporting that he died of cancer before having their report taken down. His family later told the media that he died of a sudden cerebral hemorrhage, but then a former associate came forward to claim that he had actually ended his own life. In July, Foreign Minister Qin Gang was removed from office on accusations of an extramarital affair. A few weeks after that, Zhu Chensang, the commander of the PLA Strategic Support Forces and a member of China's secretive Third Department, which is roughly analogous to America's NSA, went missing amid an investigation into misconduct. In September, the head of the PLA military court, Cheng Dongfeng, and the defense minister, Li Shangfu, were removed from office and just disappeared. Then, on December 27th, the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference removed 3 senior executives from their positions within state-owned missile manufacturing firms. And just 2 days later, on December 29th, 9 more senior defense officials, including 5 current or past commanders of the Rocket Force and at least 2 acquisition officials, were all removed from their posts as well. All told, this amounts to around 22 high-profile officials losing their jobs, or their lives, seemingly tied to China's ongoing corruption purge. And it's extremely important at times like this to highlight how tight a grip the Chinese government has on media within its own nation. All newspapers and news broadcasters within China are state-owned and heavily censored. The international nonprofit organization Reporters Without Borders listed China as the world's single largest jailer of journalists in 2022, as well as the world's second largest distributor of state-sanctioned propaganda behind only North Korea. That is to say that these 22 officials were just well known enough within their respective fields to make their removal from office or outright disappearance tough to obscure on the world stage. It's entirely feasible that the actual number of officials or other military personnel caught up in this far-reaching purge effort could be substantially higher. And while the finer points of these corruption allegations and the ensuing purge of military personnel remain somewhat murky, the scandal they've created has grown much too large for even China to hide. In the first week of January, Chinese President Xi Jinping addressed the growing list of purged officials, calling the state of corruption within the Chinese government, quote, dire and complex, in a televised address before China's Central Commission for Disciplinary Action. The following day, a former Chinese military official who defected in 2016, Yao Chen, appeared on Radio Free Asia to shed more light on fundamental issues within the PLARF, claiming that personnel would drain aircraft fuel and even use solid fuel removed from missiles to cook food, explaining that the solid fuel mixtures burned cleanly without odor, making them suitable for the task. He claimed that widespread corruption within China's military apparatus is often less about greed and more about widespread shortages of basic necessities, though he also said that those shortages are often caused by budgetary funds being diverted to cover extravagant dinners and gifts for senior officials. Now, I cannot substantiate claims about the efficacy of rocket fuel for cooking, but these claims are in keeping with my own previous reporting on the extremely low rate of pay for Chinese military personnel, even after you take China's 45% lower cost of living into account. Since taking power in 2012, rooting out corruption in China's massive but sluggish military has been a priority for Xi Jinping, but recent events have made it clear that he still has his work cut out for him. I'm going to quote Alfred Wu, who's an associate professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore, from an interview he recently did with Reuters. More heads will roll. The purge that's centered around the rocket force is not over. So, while we can't confirm the claims made in that Bloomberg report, it's evident that something is going on, and it is centered around the People's Liberation Army rocket force. So let's dive a bit deeper into the technical side of these allegations. Because while there's clearly something going on, the truth is, from a technological standpoint, these claims don't really add up, at least in my opinion, particularly the part about water in the missiles. Now, the problem here is that that's just not really how ICBMs work. China operates two different types of ICBMs, liquid-fueled weapons like their DF-5 and solid-fuel missiles like their newer DF-31. Now, solid-fueled missiles clearly wouldn't be filled with water. They're powered by a combination of a fuel, an oxidizer, and a binding agent in a solid form. So even if you were going to pull that fuel out to, say, cook dinner, you still wouldn't fill it back up with water. So the missiles in question would need to be the liquid-fueled variety. But the thing is, liquid-fueled ICBMs are not stored for long durations with any fuel on board. The fuel used in these rockets is hazardous and extremely corrosive, and as a result, can't be kept inside the weapons for extended periods of time. Instead, upon receiving the command to launch, these weapons have to be fueled, a process that can take as long as 90 minutes before they're ready to fire. Now, this is one of those places where I find myself wondering if that insider source was a subject matter expert or the guy delivering coffee. It does seem at least possible to me that these water and missiles claims could have something to do with there being something seriously wrong with these missiles, and a common Chinese idiom or turn of phrase was used while describing it, and that got lost in translation. For instance, one common Mandarin idiom translates directly to something like water drops, stone is bored through, which could really be compared to the Old English saying, little strokes fell great oaks, basically pointing to how, over time, lots of little things can add up to have a huge impact. But since we can't confirm that, let's try taking these claims at face value. As Joseph Trevithick pointed out in an excellent piece for The War Zone, it's possible that these liquid-fueled missiles were fueled during a training exercise and then flushed with water after being drained, and a great deal of water was left over in those tanks. But to be honest, as feasible as that does sound, that doesn't seem like the sort of thing that you'd fire 24 senior defense officials over, including acquisition officials, and disappear a few more. Another possibility that I first saw posited by Twitter user Lim49Spartan is that the post-boost vehicle housed in the upper portions of these missiles were the real culprits. Now, post-boost vehicles, or PBVs, are also known as re-entry vehicles. They activate after the final stage of the rocket has fired, using their own small, usually liquid-fueled rocket motors to steer the re-entry vehicle toward its target during descent. Now, these assemblies are vibration tested using non-fuel liquids to ensure that they function correctly before they're fueled, sealed, and installed in the missile. It's possible that the post-boost vehicles in these missiles were filled with water for testing and then never drained. Now, if re-entry vehicles filled with water were shipped off and installed in missiles, that would certainly be enough to get a bunch of people fired, but not for a wide-scale purge of senior defense officials under allegations of corruption. It also seems feasible to me that what we could really be talking about here are the fuel tanks on site meant to fill up those liquid fuel rockets. Corrupt officials could have sold off that fuel and refilled the tanks with water, and corruption Bob's your uncle, we've got a purge on our hands. Now, to be clear, these are just possibilities, and there are certain to be others that we haven't addressed. But regardless of that, the evidence makes it clear that China believes they have a significant corruption problem within the PLARF and well beyond it. And as such, we should see these claims of water and missiles not as the foundation of these allegations, but rather as one of what could be many symptoms. Perhaps just one of the few to make it out of China and their draconian approach to media censorship. But as for Chinese missile silo doors failing to function, that one does not require as much imagination. You see, China's nuclear arsenal has been expanding at an absolutely unprecedented rate in recent years. Their total number of nuclear warheads has doubled since 2020. In 2021, satellite imagery confirmed that China was building between 250 and 300 new nuclear ICBM silos. And in January of 2023, the U.S. Strategic Command issued a notice to Congress letting them know that China had officially surpassed the United States in the total number of land-based nuclear missile launchers in service. Now, to be clear, the United States still has a much larger nuclear warhead stockpile, but U.S. intelligence assessments now believe China will reach parity with America's deployed nuclear arsenal by 2035 or so. In other words, we're talking about an absolutely massive undertaking, and the construction aspects of it are being handled by a Chinese construction industry that is world-renowned for its corruption. Now, I understand that corruption can be a pretty subjective term, but the truth is, the corruption in China's construction industry is so pronounced that it's pretty easy to quantify. Back in 2014, New York-based independent market research firm Charney Research surveyed some 2,293 C-suite executives from all over China's economy, and they found that 35% of all companies surveyed openly admitted to having to pay bribes to Chinese officials in order to function. But it was the worst among real estate and construction firms, with 41% of all respondents claiming they have to pay bribes to Chinese officials in order to operate. Corruption as a standard Chinese business practice is so deep-seated that it extends beyond their borders. According to the U.S. State Department, the World Bank barred Chinese road and bridge projects for 8 years after proving that Chinese firms committed fraud in the bidding process for road projects in the Philippines. And then it happened again with another major road project in Bangladesh in 2018, and then again that same year in Malaysia with a railroad project. And when corruption in the construction process doesn't get you, corruption in the contracting process will, thanks to something people have taken to calling China's debt trap diplomacy. Many of the large-scale construction efforts within China's Belt and Road Initiative are funded by China giving these developing nations substantial high-interest loans that Beijing knows they likely won't be able to pay back. And then, when these nations inevitably miss a payment, China steps in and seizes the port that they just built, and then leases it to one of their own state-owned construction companies for 99 years. We saw this happen to Sri Lanka in 2018. China has weaponized corruption within their own construction industry to trick developing nations into letting them build what will inevitably become Chinese-controlled ports within their nations. But it doesn't even end there, because even if you can make the payments now, you may not be able to for long because of even more corruption within the Chinese construction industry, with many of these firms using substandard materials and unsafe practices to complete these projects. In just one Wall Street Journal report last year, they identified a Chinese-built hydroelectric dam in Pakistan that had to be shut down after just 4 years after cracks started to emerge in the dam's walls. In Uganda, another hydroelectric dam is still functioning, despite identifying more than 500 construction deficiencies because Uganda just can't afford to lose the power output. In Angola, a Chinese housing project that's less than 10 years old is nearly unlivable because of cracks appearing in the walls and mold coming out of the ceilings. And in Ecuador, another large-scale Chinese hydroelectric dam is showing thousands of cracks already. But in all 4 of these cases, these nations are still paying China billions in high-interest loans because we all know what'll happen if they don't. So when you see how widespread, accepted, and even encouraged corruption is within China's construction industry, it doesn't seem all that crazy that there would be widespread corruption in a massive construction endeavor like, say, building 300 nuclear missile silos in just a few years. So while we can't get to China to independently verify that these silo doors aren't functioning, I don't have much trouble believing it's the case. But, and there is always a but, the Bloomberg report did not offer any further details into how widespread this missile or silo issue may be, nor can we say for sure which types of missiles were affected. The only thing we can really say for certain is that China's military is undergoing a significant shakeup that points to serious problems in the highest echelons of their command, particularly within the PLARF. And because that branch of the military at the center of this corruption purge is not only responsible for China's nuclear apparatus, but also for China's sole hypersonic weapon in service, and the anti-ship weapons that serve as the basis for China's anti-access area denial strategy throughout the Pacific, one could be inclined to think this revelation points to China being a paper tiger. But to tell you the truth, I would caution against forming that conclusion. As the world watched Russia fumble what was meant to be a rapid and overwhelming invasion of Ukraine, many have now come to believe that Moscow, long seen as a leader in disinformation and propaganda spaces, seemed to fall victim to its own misdirection efforts. After decades of making grandiose technological claims, Russia's military has proven to be largely inept, due in no small part to a lack of training and rampant corruption within both the military and industrial spheres. In a real way, because of Moscow's inability to detect the smell of its own propaganda farts, they created the opportunity for a heroic Ukrainian defense that's still holding to this day, despite Russia's massive numerical and often even technological advantages. And now, with many intelligence assessments suggesting that China was looking to invade Taiwan within just the next 3 years or so, we may be seeing the result of China's own efforts to make sure they don't fall into that same trap, falling victim to their own propaganda hype machine so fervently that they lose sight of their own very real shortcomings. This corruption purge may cause international embarrassment today, but it could also result in a more capable Chinese military tomorrow. At the end of the day, what we make of claims about Chinese missiles filled with water, or what we think of China's purge of senior defense officials, all matters less than what becomes of the Chinese military as a result. Is this the first step toward a renewed People's Liberation Army that emphasizes real military capability over China's long-standing approach to chasing prestige and saber-rattling? Or is the new modernized Chinese military actually little more than just another housing development built with shoddy materials on a corrupt foundation? And what we're seeing now are those cracks beginning to emerge. And while I have opinions on that, I honestly couldn't tell you for sure. The only thing I do know is that the answer to that question will almost certainly dictate the way conflict unfolds throughout the rest of the 21st century. And on that somewhat unnerving note ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.